Did you know there was an official Super Famicom expansion with 2 cartridge slots, and all its games could connect with each other? Similar to Pokemon with a link cable, you could trade and fight with friends, and even steal their characters in battle for keeps. You could also transfer your characters in one game over to its sequels. And every game had a universal currency you could move from cartridge to cartridge to buy the best unlockables at in-game stores. It was one of the most clever add-ons of its time, but unfortunately, time was also its biggest impediment to success. It hit Japanese stores less than a week after the Nintendo 64, and thus was doomed to be overshadowed from the very start. Despite its ambitious goals and potential, the add-on had an incredibly short lifespan. At less than 100 days, it was shorter even than the Virtual Boy. More than half its games ultimately got canned, and nowadays, it's mostly forgotten, even in Japan. Search online in any language, and you'll only find a few paragraphs, and a lot of it's not even accurate. So, we dug up some old Japanese magazines to learn its history, and today we're going to look at the rise, fall, and why things turned out the way they did. This is the full story of the SuFami Turbo. The SuFami Turbo was made by Bandai and officially licensed by Nintendo. In fact, SuFami is short for Super Famicom. The marketing angles that it takes a Famicom that's already Super and kicks it up a notch to Turbo. In our recent videos on the Satellaview, SNES CD drive, and Nintendo Power, we talked about how, in part, all 3 systems were made in response to the skyrocketing manufacturing costs of Super Famicom cartridges. By 1996, $100 games had become the norm, with some retailing for $120, $130, even $150. All those systems were built around alternate methods of delivering software, whether it was beaming games down from satellites, putting them on CDs, or installing kiosks all over Japan for downloading games onto reusable flashcards. The Turbo was designed to tackle the same problem, but with a different solution: mini cartridges. With a 3-pronged strategy, Bandai had figured out how to cut costs in half. For starters, they took some components that are already in normal Super Famicom carts, like the lockout chip, and stuck them in the Turbo instead, along with a 1/4 megabyte of storage that held a text font and other basic data. Now, you might not think that a font would take up a lot of space, but that's over 4,000 Japanese characters stored as sprites, which adds up. By putting all that stuff in the add-on itself, none of it needed to be in each individual minicart. Storage was expensive back then, so the second cost-cutting measure was limiting Turbo games to being, at most, only 1 megabyte. That's less than a lot of Super Famicom games coming out in 1996, but still more than enough in the hands of experienced developers. Early generation titles like Super Mario World, Final Fantasy IV, and Zelda: A Link to the Past had all been made with less than a megabyte. In other words, just because storage is low doesn't mean a game has to be small, if you know what you're doing. And third, Bandai dedicated themselves to efficient development cycles. For example, by making quick sequels to their best games instead of building them all from scratch. The most famous example of that strategy is how Ocarina of Time took 4 years to make, while its sequel Majora's Mask took only 1 year, with a fraction of the budget. Turbo series would do the same. By combining all these savings, Bandai could sell games for only $40. The Turbo itself also sold for $40. A lot of games you could get bundled with the add-on for the low price of just $68, meaning a Turbo and 2 games cost less than just one normal Super Famicom title. That was the Turbo's promise when it was first teased in early '96. On April 2nd, Bandai threw a big coming out party for the system, where Japanese press got to play a few games and hear some big announcements. Bandai had the rights to major IP, including Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, Ultraman, Gundam, and lots more popular anime and manga franchises. They'd already made dozens of Super Famicom games based on those properties, and now they were bringing a lot of them to the Turbo. Plus some original IP, with a goal of 30 exclusives by the end of the year. The release date was revealed as June 28th, exactly 5 days after the Nintendo 64 hit store shelves. By the way, the N64 only ended up getting 10 games by the end of the year. 16-bit projects were quicker to make though, and Bandai had the development capacity, experience, and the IP rights to make it happen. Japanese magazines were pretty excited, and Famitsu speculated it could spark a new boom for the Super Famicom. To put all this in historical context, the Turbo was sort of a sequel to a Famicom add-on Bandai made 4 years earlier, the DayTAC joint ROM system, which also used inexpensive mini carts. The two add-ons even had some of the same franchises like Gundam, Ultraman, and Crayon Shin-chan. DayTAC's main gimmick was its card scanner for adding content to its games, like a Game Boy Advance e-reader. The Turbo, however, had a different gimmick. 2 cartridge slots that, when combined, allowed for some interesting ideas, some of which felt like Pokemon Link cable shenanigans dialed up to 11. Gimmicks get a bad rap, by the way, but aren't necessarily a bad thing. The DS's dual screens were a gimmick, and you could say the Switch's hybrid format is too. Done right, gimmicks can be awesome, and a lot more interesting than just improving graphics or adding more storage capacity. The SD Gundam Generation games were the Turbo's main attraction, and also made best use of its gimmick. So I'll sum up the series real quick, then explain how they utilized the double cartridge slots. There were 6 Gundam games, each based on a different era of the anime. The first was based on the original Mobile Suit Gundam from 1979, the second on Zeta Gundam from 1985, and so on, with the 6th ending on 1994's G Gundam. They're all grid-based tactics RPGs that play kinda like a mix between Fire Emblem and Advance Wars, where victory is achieved by destroying all your opponent's units or capturing their headquarters. Cities can be captured for money, which you can spend to buy new Gundams. And you can capture enemy units as well, in a prisoner of war system that makes some permanent additions to your army. Units can level up with experience points, change classes, and all kinds of stuff you'd expect in a tactics game, plus a little more. If you only had one Gundam cartridge, you'd play it like any other game. But if you had 2, you could transfer mechs you raised in the first over to the second, kinda like carrying your Gen 1 Pokemon over to Gen 2. You didn't have to play Gundam games in order, by the way. You could skip around if you wanted. Another use of the double slot was 2 friends could go head-to-head using the armies they'd built in their own campaigns, similar to Pokemon Link battles. And if you destroyed your friends' battleships, you could capture their Gundams as prisoners of war and keep them forever. If that's too cutthroat though, friends could simply trade with each other for the purposes of collecting and battling throughout their adventures. There were also a couple of fighting games available at launch based on Ultraman and Ultra 7. If you had one game and your friend the other, you could combine them to double the fighter roster, and by battling you could learn each other's special moves that otherwise were version exclusives. Another interesting mechanic was that every Turbo game had an in-game currency, Turbo Coins, which you earned by beating levels, achieving high scores, and so on. Then you could transfer coins from one game to another, which was especially useful since buying the best stuff like Gundams and the most powerful Ultra attacks could get pretty expensive. For some games, it didn't really make sense to have a store, so for those, you couldn't spend Turbo coins, but you could earn them and send them to games where they could be spent. Like in another launch title, Poi Poi Ninja World, an original IP that played a lot like Bomberman, but supported up to 5 players if you had a multi-tap. You could make custom maps and play on them with your friends, or combine you and your friends' maps into hybrid levels. Poi Poi didn't have a store, but you could rack up cash and transfer it to other games. So basically, all that together's what Turbo was all about. Games at a fraction of the price, with interesting ways to link them together. Although I should mention, there were 4 games that didn't link to anything else, except for coin transfers.
The first was Gegege no Kitaro Yokai Donjara, which featured characters from an iconic 1960s manga of the same name. Here you'll find them playing a board game similar to Mahjong called Donjara, plus a couple more minigames.
Just like Poi Poi, if you had a multi-tap, 5 friends could play at once. Another was Gekiso Sentai Car Ranger, which is basically the original Japanese version of Power Rangers, adapted here into sort of a Mega Man-like melee side-scroller. All 5 Rangers have different abilities, like double jumps, stronger attacks, and running faster. Sailor Moon Fua Fua Panic 2 is a puzzle game with 3 game modes: Story, Versus, and Puzzle. It's a sequel to the original Fua Fua Panic that had come out as a standard Super Famicom cart the year before. Then there was Crayon Shin-chan Rain Boots Splash,
an action puzzle game based on an irreverent 5-year-old from manga and anime popular in the 90s.
It plays kinda similar to Bomberman as well. These 4 games were all standalone, but could still connect for currency exchange. So for example, you could earn some coins beating levels in a Gundam game, transfer it over and gamble on Donjara, double your money, then send it back and purchase some top-tier Gundams, or over to Ultraman to buy some new special attacks. Bandai did their best to make the Turbo a hit, hosting giveaways for 100 free systems and running magazine and TV ads all over the country.
SuFami Turbo 出現モビルスーツクラスチェック自慢の艦隊で立ちユニットを奪え取って取られて熱くなれ SD ガンダムジェネレーションセットでお得
Games were coming out at a rate of 1 a week. Bandai was on track for their goal of 30 exclusives by the end of the year. But, unfortunately, they ran into some problems. For starters, the add-on quickly got a reputation for erasing save data if you weren't careful inserting and removing cartridges. Also, the games felt kinda low budget. Even the Turbo's crown jewel, the Gundam games, were all pretty samey, with their main differences boiling down to just the units and maps.
Sameness was inevitable though, considering how fast Bandai was pumping them out. That was, after all, kind of the point of the system. But even still, releasing 6 Gundam games in only 2 months is kind of a lot. But Ultraman was even more egregious. You could easily reach the end credits in under 20 minutes, and Ultra 7 is basically a copy-paste job of the same game, just with different fighters and stages. Each game only had 3 fighters and 3 stages anyway, so they probably should have just combined them into a single game. Maybe you could argue that, like Pokemon, you weren't supposed to buy both. Your friend was meant to buy one so you could link them together, but even granting that consideration, I mean, yeah, mini-carts were less than half price, but a lot of them felt like less than half a game. The Japanese magazines who were initially excited for Turbo quickly lost enthusiasm after playing its games. The Gundam series fared best, averaging 5.5 out of 10 from Famitsu magazine. In their review, they heaped praise on the inventive link mechanics and some of the tactical innovations like Prisoners of War, but complained that all 6 games were too similar, and the graphics looked last gen. The Ultra games they gave 4 out of 10, saying they were too light on content, the combat too simplistic, and felt they should have been bundled in as free pack-in titles.
The rest of the library got 4s and 5s as well, with Famitsu citing subpar graphics, short runtimes, and an overall feeling of cheapness. Now, to be fair, Famitsu is a bit stingier than Western outlets. In their 40-year history reviewing thousands of games, they've only scored a couple dozen as 10 out of 10. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave Super Mario All-Stars a 9, for example, but Famitsu only gave it an 8. IGN heralded Pokémon as a perfect 10, but Famitsu said it's a 7. Point being, a Famitsu 5 doesn't mean a game's horrible, just that it's average. And that sums up how reviewers felt about Turbo games in general, that at best, they were mid. Maybe if the add-on came out a few years earlier, these games might have looked better compared to what else was on the market in, say, 1993. But releasing a week after N64 was just not the best time for budget Super Famicom titles. They were also competing with Nintendo's own add-on, the Satellaview, which also struggled to find a player base in '96. And it didn't help that Pokémon landed a few months before and was currently taking over Japan. By the way, we keep comparing Turbo Link mechanics to Pokémon, but to be clear, Bandai had been working on it before Pokémon even came out. So despite the similarities, they weren't ripping off Game Freak's ideas. Earlier in the year, Bandai spoke about making a linkable RPG series that continued cart to cart, similar to how the Gundam games functioned. It never ended up getting made, but does sound a bit like how Pokémon Generations ended up working years later. Technically speaking, an actual Pokémon game could have been made for Turbo, a 16-bit version where you use the double cartridge slot instead of a link cable. Game Freak was unlikely to ever make that game or license out the rights, but it's interesting to imagine if the Turbo had gone more in that direction.
Another fun thought experiment is how things might have gone if they managed to borrow some of Nintendo's IP.
Mario or Zelda launch titles would have been ideal, of course, but thinking more realistically, a smaller series like F-Zero might have been enough to establish a foothold. One of the concepts Bandai teased at launch was a racing game where you can design your own cars and race them against friends with their custom cars. Making an F-Zero Turbo in that style would have attracted some much needed interest in the system. That's just wishful thinking on our part though, because fact is, Turbo just never got any must-have titles to draw in a big enough audience. The Gundam games were decent, but there's only so many Gundam fans who want to play tactics games. The series only appealed to a niche inside a niche, when what the Turbo really needed was something with broader appeal. Even the Daytax Dragon Ball Z Fighter made a bigger splash than Gundam, and that add-on was kind of a flop too. If you want to hear more about the Daytac, by the way, check out our recent video covering NES and Famicom expansions. Bandai never released Turbo sales numbers, but we can get a rough idea from Famitsu sales charts. Every week, they tracked video games sold across Japan and published the 30 best sellers. When the first two Gundam games came out, they barely made the chart, coming in at 27 and 28. The next week, they disappeared from the top 30 and never returned. The third and fourth Gundams ranked 27 and 30 in their launch week, then fell off too. No other Turbo game ever made the top 30, which means sales had to be pretty poor. Bandai pulled advertising soon after, and cancelled all future releases. The last games came out on September 27th, 1996, just 92 days after the Turbo's launch, meaning its entire library only amounted to 13 games. The ones you heard about earlier in this video? That was it. The initial goal was 30 new games by the end of the year, and presumably more were planned into the future. Little is known about what games were supposed to come after those first 13, though Bandai still had Dragon Ball and lots more IP they could have pulled from. Before launch, they'd announced a port of Tetris 2 plus Bombliss, which released as a standard $85 Super Famicom cart a few years before, but now was going to be a $38 mini cart. Bandai had dozens of Super Famicom titles they could have ported over if they wanted to let Turbo fans get them half price. But ports don't appear to have been included in that count of 30, and to be clear, the only one they ever announced was Tetris Bombliss. Japanese websites claim a 7th Gundam entry based on Gundam Wing was in the works, along with 2 more Ultra games.
None of them cite sources though, and 90s magazines like Famitsu and Famimaga never mentioned them.
Searching the Japanese internet doesn't yield any reliable sources either, so we can't say for a fact if those claims are true or not. That said, we wouldn't be surprised if more Gundam and Ultraman were in the cards, since they were the add-ons to main franchises. Now's probably a good time to mention that info about the Turbo is super sparse online, even in Japanese. The Japanese Wikipedia page, for example, is so short it'd fit on a single sheet of paper, and cites 0 sources.
English Wikipedia is even thinner, and doesn't have sources either, and a lot of it's wrong, like most of the game's titles, how linking them worked, and which games were available as pack-ins. It never even mentions Turbo coins.
Pretty much all other coverage online is more or less copy-pasted from those 2 Wikipedia pages. Info and footage for the games is pretty bare bones as well, which is what made us want to dig up old magazines, record some gameplay, and make this video. That, and the fact it's just a super cool premise for a console expansion. 2 slots for competitively priced mini cartridges with games that connect to each other and have a universal currency system. It's an awesome hardware concept. Unfortunately, all that potential was wasted because Bandai half-assed making games for it, then immediately gave up, instead of fighting to get it on the right track. Nowadays, the Turbo's been mostly forgotten, and you can find them on Japanese auction sites selling for even cheaper than they were 30 years ago. If you enjoyed this video, check out our recent mini-documentaries about the Super Nintendo CD and Satellaview add-ons. They were awesome hardware concepts too, but yet again, ended in failure. We've got more expansions coming up as well, so subscribe if that sounds up your alley. Special thanks to our translator Jacob, Good Tofu Friday for tech consultation, and especially Eurasia M for recording footage of every Turbo game for us. And of course, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.